Morning. Okay, again. Good morning and bonjour to everybody in Canada and overseas. I am Sheikh Tijan Bangura, Chair of Africa Study Group of the Canadian International Council here in Ottawa. It's a real pleasure to welcome you to this virtual session on the theme African vaccine manufacturing, the challenges and the successes. La production de vaccins en Afrique, les enjeux et les réalisations. I would like to acknowledge that the Africa Study Group is hosting this meeting from Ottawa on the traditional unceded Algonquin Anishinaabe territory. Je tiens à souligner que nous tenons cette session du groupe de réflexion sur l'Afrique à partir d'Ottawa, territoire traditionnel non cédé du peuple Anishinaabe Algonquin. This session is part of our webinar series on COVID and post-COVID in Africa. On November 25th, 2021, we spoke about COVID governance issues, and we addressed the last Oxfam report called the inequality virus. Today, we are talking about African vaccine manufacturing, the challenges and the successes. Le webinaire sera animé par Dr. Marcia Burdett, vice-présidente du groupe de réflexion sur l'Afrique. Elle est titulaire d'un doctorat en sciences politiques de l'Université Columbia, New York. Et Marcia a poursuivi une énorme carrière universitaire, suivie de 25 ans au ministère canadien des Affaires étrangères. Elle s'intéresse depuis longtemps à l'Afrique, en particulier à l'Afrique centrale et australe. Son livre « Zambia Between Two Worlds » et une série d'articles ont porté sur la transition économique majeure du pays lorsque ces nouveaux dirigeants ont entrepris de nationaliser l'industrie du cuivre, principal moteur économique du pays. Des articles ultérieurs ont traité les industries d'intrants pour le commerce agricole du Zimbabwe dans les années 1980 et 90. Without any further delay, Marcia, à toi la parole.
Bonjour tout le monde et bienvenue à cette session. Good day to the world, North America, Europe and Africa. And merci, Sheikh, pour cette introduction. I'm going to be the moderator for today's webinar on African vaccine manufacturing, the challenges and the successes. The COVID pandemic exposed the global injustices of the health system. Africa has suffered greatly from the inequalities of vaccine distribution during the most recent pandemic. Many Africans died unnecessarily of COVID during the first half of 2021, when vaccines were largely available there, were not largely unavailable there, and were widely distributed in wealthy countries such as Canada. This injustice has led to the growing pressure for African manufacturing of vaccines for COVID, polio, malaria, Ebola, HIV/AIDS, TB, and others. Several initiatives in Africa have shown great promise and indicate that there is human capacity, technical skills, and willing investors to set up manufacturing and thus start the move forward to advance the continent's health sovereignty and security. Today's webinar presents two panelists who speak from experience with developing vaccines for Africa. Also joining the panel will be Geoff York, the Globe and Mail correspondent based in Johannesburg, South Africa. Each of our panelists will speak for approximately 20 minutes, And then our resource person, Geoff York, will add information, pose questions, and so on for another 10, 15 minutes. Then at the end of the webinar, end of the formal part of the webinar, we'll open up for questions and answers from our membership. You can send your questions in French or in English in the Q&R box of the Zoom system. So let me introduce the panelists. Oh. First, looking for my papers, pardon me. Professor Petro Terblanche has a successful track record in the strategic and operational management of technology-intensive organizations. She has played a key role in the design and implementation of South Africa's biotechnology strategy. She holds the position of Managing Director of Afrigen Biologics Limited, based in Cape Town, South Africa. Afrigen hosts the global mRNA technology vaccine hub under the COVAX initiative and has an mRNA COVID-19 vaccine candidate in development as part of the global program to build capacity and capabilities in low-income countries to design and develop and produce mRNA vaccines. Petro also holds a part-time position of professor in the Faculty of Health Sciences at Northwest University. A considerable part of her career was in research, development, innovation in the South Africa Medical Research Council, as well as the Council for Scientific and Industrial Research. She has held and is holding several strategic public and private sector board positions in South Africa, as well as the position as president of the Stakeholders Organization for the Global Alliance for TB Drug Discovery and Development. She holds several qualifications, which includes a Master of Science and a Doctor of Science in Medical Oncology from the University of Pretoria. Postdoctoral, she was a visiting scientist at Harvard University School of Public Health, and thereafter completed a Management of Technology program at Massachusetts Institute of Technology, in addition to several management and leadership programs from leading institutions globally. Professor Terblanche is the author of more than 200 scientific publications and conference papers in public health. She was recently acknowledged as one of the legends of science by the Academy of Sciences, South Africa. Our second panelist is Dr. Simon Agwale, Ph.D., and he is the CEO of Innovative Biotech Nigeria and Innovative Biotech USA, Inc. He's a member of the board of the African Vaccine Manufacturers Initiatives and chair of Vaccine Technical Working Group. He's also an advisor to the West Africa Health Organization and part of a recently established ECOWAS Vaccines Task Force. He is currently the lead of Partnership for Africa Vaccines Manufacturing of the Africa Centers for Disease Control. Dr. Agwale has a vision for the development and investigation of HIV vaccine constructs from prevalent Nigerian strains, which are relevant to Nigerians. He's also currently developing novel vaccines against COVID-19, Ebola, HPV, and HIV using innovative viral-like particles. Through Innovative, Dr. Agwale is striving to further develop and refine these dynamic novel treatments, and in doing so, expand domestic vaccine manufacturing capabilities in Nigeria to serve the African community. Dr. Agwale was a postdoc fellow at the Institute of Human Virology in Baltimore, USA, and visiting scientist at various institutions in Brazil, Germany, UK, including the US Vaccine Research Center and US Center for Disease Control and Prevention in Atlanta. Dr. Agwale was West Africa's representatives on the HIV/AIDS for Developing Countries Coordinating Committee at the European and Developing Countries Clinical Trials Program, where he was also the chair of the African Scientists Committee. He's a recipient of several scholarship, fellowships, and grants from reputable organizations around the world. He has also authored and co-authored numerous noteworthy publications. And our third panelist is Geoff York, the Globe and Mail's Africa Bureau Chief based in Johannesburg, South Africa. Just to give an extra word, it is really Geoff's article that he published in the Globe and Mail last October, which was the instigation for organizing this webinar. He drew our attention to the importance of African manufacturing and the new innovations coming out of Africa. Geoff has been the foreign correspondent for the Globe and Mail since '94, including 7 years as the Moscow bureau chief and 7 years as the Beijing bureau chief. He's a veteran war correspondent who has covered war zones since '92 in Somalia, Sudan, Chechnya, Iraq, and Afghanistan. He's the author of 3 books, including 2 books on Aboriginal issues in Canada. He has received several journalistic awards, including a National Magazine Award and 5 National Newspaper Awards. So we have a wonderful panel today. So without any more to do, I'm going to hand over to our first speaker, Professor Terblanche.
Marta, thank you for a very kind introduction. Bonjour and good day to our participants. Big thank you for allowing and inviting us to participate in this very important Africa study group discussion. I'm going to take a few steps back, and my colleague Simon will certainly also complement discussions around some vaccine platforms and some priorities for the continent. But to our participants, imagine a continent of 54 states, a vast continent with huge diversity, a continent with an exceptionally high burden of infectious diseases, but a continent that only has the ability to produce 1% of the vaccines it needs for basic health care. A continent that has 1.4 billion people, and a continent that utilizes 25% of all vaccines that is produced globally. When a pandemic hits, imagine a continent with those characteristics, ability to respond or not. So the COVID-19 pandemic again surfaced and resurfaced the vulnerabilities of a continent that does not have the capacity and the capability to produce its own vaccines, and a continent that then had to wait last in line to receive essential vaccines in a time of insufficient global supply. That first few months in 2020, in the time when the pandemic just united the world in fear and in action also started on this continent. And that gave the birth to the creation of what we call Agenda 2063. It is a complete new public health order for the continent, and one of the first and most and very important pillars of that health order is expanding and diversifying vaccine manufacturing capabilities. Pre-2020, pre-COVID, the continent had selected areas of vaccine manufacturing, yellow fever, Senegal, quite well known, Tunisia, Egypt, about 5 entities providing vaccines for the continent with minimal abilities to produce the drug product. So maybe just to explain again for our audience that may not be in the vaccine space. Vaccines consist of what we call the active ingredient, which is the drug product. And in the case of mRNA, that will contain the RNA and the genetic material that will tell the body to arm and to protect. And the drug product is the final product that you see in a vial, which is formulated in a formulation that is safe, thermostable, and suitable for administration safely to human body. So on the African continent, the ability to produce the drug product was almost non-existent. Now, 2.5 years later, and Simon is certainly going to talk about that, we have seen a continent in transformation. we have now, in the last 2 years, more than 17 projects and investments being pledged to capacitate the continent. And although many of those are for full finish, that means that we will import the drug product and we will full finish and distribute. We will not make the vaccines here. That is a step forward for us. But what is important for the continent is to actually produce the vaccines, to have a fully secure and sustainable system where we make the vaccine, we full finish it, and we distribute it in our healthcare system. What are the challenges of that? A continent that does not have a sector, a vertically integrated sector, means that it means that we don't have the skills, we don't have the workforce, we don't, in many instances, most of the countries, we don't have the regulatory systems that can support such a sector. We have not fully developed distribution systems. We don't have the financing systems. And we have policy voids that will support a full ecosystem for fully integrated vaccine manufacturing. The Partners for African Vaccine Manufacturing under the African CDC has developed a strategy for the continent. And the vision is that we will go from 1% vaccine production to 60% by the year 2040. And the good news is that even in the last 18 months, 2 years, we have seen active implementation of this strategy. We've identified the key diseases, legacy diseases, routine requirements. We've identified some of the platforms which will be essential for the production of these vaccines. And Simon is going to talk about the platforms that he is also establishing in the efforts to capacitate the system. We have funded and creating R&D hubs that can help us to develop vaccines and to develop the skills that can support an ecosystem. So this is a continent which is going from 1% to 60% over a period of 20 years. This is a continent that in the last 2 years have now active investment in expanding capacity and diversifying capacity to build this sector on the continent. We require, of course, policy reform. We require the procurement system for vaccines to be modified and transformed to support local production. For us as a continent that relies on imports, we need Gavi, UNICEF, the global procurers of essential vaccines to support local manufacturing so that we build the industry. Marcia has asked me to talk about a specific case study, and I'm very, very happy to do that. During COVID, the early months of COVID-19, when vaccination started and there was no vaccines available, not sufficient vaccines available for the African continent, and in fact for low and middle income countries. Under the COVAX initiative, the World Health Organization and partners took a leadership position, and they made a decision to create a structure that will be able to provide access to low and middle income countries to key technology, mRNA vaccine manufacturing technology, and to build capacity in low and middle income countries, and largely also in Africa, to be able to have mRNA vaccine manufacturing capabilities for pandemic response, but also for pandemic preparedness. So the mRNA Hub program, which was announced on the 21st of June in 2021 by the World Health Organization and partners, was a very ambitious program. It was a program which is about empowerment of low and middle income countries and rapid response to create capacity. That program was structured to receive technology, turnkey technology from Big Pharma, expedite with speed the creation of capacity, and to get COVID-19 vaccines into the clinics. The technology transfer component did not happen. And that, I think, is part of why this case study is so important. The continent could demonstrate in a very short period of time, after realizing that we will not receive technology, mobilize scientific and technical expertise to develop our own COVID-19 vaccine from concept now in clinical development and preparing for clinical trials. But what also happened, because we didn't get a product tech transfer, strategically what we're building is a platform. A platform is equipment, knowledge, people, processes, systems, methods that allows you, an entity, to do multiple vaccines on that platform, design them, develop them, and manufacture them. So this platform that's been built here in Cape Town with the support of global partnerships will be transferred to 15 other countries and 15 other companies, providing access to a new technology for vaccine manufacturing, not a new technology for product development, but a new technology demonstrated for vaccine development. This program changes a lot of the paradigms. It moves from bilateral technology transfer to multilateral technology transfer. One entity giving access technology to many, many others. The program takes future relevant new technology, mRNA technology, and gives access and empower low and middle income countries. And very important for us to ensure sustainability, mRNA leans itself to smaller units of economics, smaller economies of scale, and more distributed units to cover a region in a more secure way. To make it sustainable, we have to manage the costs. So already this program are working with partners to reduce the cost of mRNA vaccines. But what we also need in low and middle income countries, and particularly Africa, we need cold chain that is normal vaccine cold chain, 2 to 8 degrees Celsius, normal refrigeration temperatures, not minus 20 or minus 70, which is what mRNA vaccines currently require. So this program, again, has partnered with partners in Belgium to develop an mRNA vaccine that is stable at 2 to 8 degrees, suitable for use on the African continent. And those programs are progressing well. But in addition, what after COVID? Now we have a platform where we can make mRNA vaccines. But when the pandemic is over, how do we sustain these platforms? So this program also, in partnership, are now looking at other vaccines. What are the legacy vaccines on the continent? Where are the needs? Where do we have unmet needs? Where can we put priorities to vaccines which are not priorities for the high-income countries? And already, this program has started a TB vaccine for mRNA TB vaccine and also launched start of an HIV vaccine development using mRNA. And in the next months, there will be announcements around other vaccines that we will develop in this program and share with low and middle income countries to empower them to be able to produce vaccines for public need. So back to the African continent. COVID-19 is a new era for this continent. There will be multiple platforms. The continent will build the capacity to fill finish, but also to produce the drug substance. And I invite you, there was a report yesterday released by Wellcome Trust, Boston Consulting Group, and BioVac, one of the foremost vaccine companies on the continent. That report are deeply examining the challenges, the needs, and the success factors for vaccine manufacturing on the continent. This continent has taken a decision that we determine our destiny. And we will see over the next 10 to 15 years, a whole new era evolve where Africa will make not only vaccines for ourselves, but also vaccines for the rest of the world. I would be very happy to take questions at the end and to engage in a conversation around these points. And thank you very much for the opportunity given. Over to you, Marcy.
Yes, I'm unmuting myself. Petro, just before I return to Simon, if you could give the information on that report from Boston in the chat line, people will be able to access it. All right, so Dr. Agwale, over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Masha, for giving us this opportunity to talk about what is happening on the continent of Africa with my very good friend, Petro. We, as we all know, I mean, established that Africa has around 16% of the world population, and we carry 25% of the world global disease burden. And we all know that 50% of the world infectious disease burden is borne by Africa. And unfortunately, less than 1% of vaccines that are required by Africans are produced in Africa. This creates a significant health security risk. But we are not only trying to address the security risk of these infectious diseases, but we are also trying to take advantage of the economic benefits of producing these products locally on the continent of Africa. As you know, 2 new biotech companies that 3 years ago, they were startup companies. But today, they are competing with some of the biggest biotech companies today on earth because they focus on research and development. I'm talking about Moderna with a 1 product, and with last year valuation was almost about $200 billion. And of course, as we know, it has dropped to, I think, about $60 billion. So we're not only trying to address security risk, but we're also looking at the economic benefit to the continent of Africa. Now, learning from COVID-19 pandemic, where we experience vaccines nationalism, and there was ban on export of raw materials and so on. Building regional manufacturing capabilities will contribute to pandemic preparedness and strengthening the response to future outbreaks. However, in order for us to be self-reliant and benefit from the billions of dollar health markets that I just mentioned in Africa by 2030, Africa needs to build an ecosystem that allows scientists to build, to develop IP, that is intellectual property, that can be used locally. There are various ways that we can develop IP. One of the ways is what Professor Petro just described. We can, develop our own IPs, we can license in, we can design around existing IPs. So these are the ways that, we can start playing ball with the other players around the world. Unfortunately, and however, most initiatives on the continent now are focused on fill-finish operations. We now need to move beyond that to produce our own drug substance, and rather than the current practice of packaging of vaccines. That's what we're doing now. That is, as we all know, is not going to solve any problem. It's only very important where there's pandemic, when you need extra doses to be being given to people. But in terms of solving that problem and then the economic benefit, it's zero. Secondly, the diseases that plague us are not necessarily the diseases that plague the West. We hear about Ebola, we hear about Marburg, Lassa, and all kinds of diseases on the continent. So we need capacity for research and development so that we can begin to make our own vaccines from scratch, taking it from research development to drug substance, and then to fill and finish. Because these diseases are only peculiar and they have no economic benefit to the big pharma around the world. It is based on these realities that my company, Innovative Biotech, is working on building an integrated vaccine manufacturing capabilities in Africa. We keep featuring with Petro, Afrigen, and Innovative because we are trying to address the real issue. The real issue is not just getting drug substance from other companies and packaging, but the real issue is making the vaccine, producing the drug substance, and then doing the fill finish. And that's the only way we can be liberated and solve our problem, solve this current pandemic, and then future outbreaks. So we're working with various partners. You can't do this alone, to build an integrated vaccine manufacturing capabilities in Nigeria. Of course, as you know, Nigeria has over 200 million people, so there's enough market in Nigeria to make this venture sustainable, because you have to look at sustainability. Now, we are taking products from R&D. We have several vaccines using the platform that we have chosen, which is the virus-like particle. Petro is working on mRNA. We are working on virus-like particles. Viral particle platform has been used to make two very important vaccines, hepatitis B vaccine and the HPV vaccine. So why is this platform attractive? It's attractive because it mimics the virus, but it does not contain the genetic material. So it is really very safe, including patients or individuals that are HIV positive. And that is why this platform is very important and needed for the continent of Africa. So it is this platform that we have used to make the candidate vaccines that we have right now gone through animal studies, and then we're in the process of moving those to human trials, including HIV vaccines, including Ebola vaccine, HPV vaccine, and then the platform we use to make other vaccines and targeting the diseases that plague the continent. So with this, I will be very happy to take questions. And then I thank you again for giving us the opportunity to address this very important issue. Thank you very much. Over.
Thank you, Dr. Agwale. So now I'm going to turn over to our third panelist, which is Geoff York, who is not a panelist so much as a resource person, contributor, question raiser, and information provider. Thanks, Geoff.
Yeah, I'd like to emphasize for our audience, first of all, how incredibly fortunate we are today to be hearing directly from these brilliant African scientists who are also very brilliant communicators, who are really explaining in great detail the importance of developing vaccines in Africa. Dr. Agwale mentioned vaccine nationalism. And, for our Canadian audience, for people in Canada who are watching this, they'll remember that when the vaccines were first being developed, when the pandemic was beginning, when there was a lot of fear and anxiety in Canada, there was a complete obsession with getting as much access to vaccines as possible and getting them as fast as possible. And really, I don't think Canadians thought very much about the rest of the world when that was happening. And as a result, the Canadian government was actually ordering 5 times more vaccines than Canadians really needed. There was such an obsession about getting access to vaccines as much as possible, as fast as possible, and getting them for everyone. But really, what the articles I was writing at the time was really to try to explain that there is an impact on the rest of the world. And I think Canadians didn't really realize that at the time. But what's happening, out of that disaster, what really happened in the rest of the world, the slow kind of access that caused many, thousands of deaths among health workers and ordinary people in Africa and other low-income countries. Out of that, now we have this understanding about the importance of developing vaccines and also controlling the technology. And that's why I'm so happy to be hearing from both of these great scientists today about this. The argument was made by some of the big pharmaceutical companies that low-income countries, African countries, don't have the capacity to do this. They implied that they don't have the capacity, the science, the human resources, and so on to do it. I know from my own visit to Afrigen in Cape Town, talking to Professor Terblanche and looking around, talking to people there. That's a facility that has brilliant young scientists, very, very talented young scientists. I know the same is true in Nigeria. These are the people who are completely able to develop these vaccines, if only given the opportunity and some funding. Just before we go on to a couple more maybe questions about the current state of the developments and so on, perhaps if you don't mind, I could ask both of the scientists just to talk a little bit about the impact of having slow access to vaccines in 2021. The vaccines were first developed and announced in December 2020. We began to see health workers in the wealthy countries getting access, getting vaccinated, but it was really many months, 6 months, 7 months, 8 months before African countries really began to have a general rollout of those vaccines. Can they just talk about what it was like in that period, the first half of 2021, to be reading? I know that both of you were very, very active, very busy and so on, doing your work and beginning to develop these vaccines. But what was it like, to be in a country which did not have general access to those vaccines? What was the impact on your friends and family members and so on in your countries at the time when you were reading about health workers getting vaccines in Canada, the United States, Britain, and Europe? Meanwhile, health workers in South Africa and Nigeria didn't have that protection. They were going to work every day. They were suffering this huge risk of being at risk of COVID-19. What was it like in those months, and how did it impact your thinking about the need to develop vaccines in Africa? Either of you can begin, sorry.
Either one. Who would like to start?
Petro. Petro.
Shall I start? Geoff, you bring back memories. So a few things, in South Africa, yes, vaccination started very late. Months into 2021, and yes, the priority was health workers, like the rest of low middle income countries. And Janssen's was the first vaccine that was in fact available for health workers, and there were donations. And there were prioritization for health workers. Luckily, South Africa regulatory systems are good, and we could really fast track the approval of these vaccines to get access, and our distribution chains were good. But following that, there was not sufficient vaccines for South Africa, for Africa. And I mean, I myself personally I remember it vividly, went to queue. I was standing in a queue at a pharmacy in Pretoria for vaccinations, and before I could get to the front, there were no vaccines left. So you have to come back next week. So it was a very emotional time for us. But what I can tell you is, as a scientist, a small group of scientists in Afrigen, already within 2 weeks after lockdown started in February, end of February, March in South Africa, we were on Zoom calls looking at what platforms are there, what can we do, what can we contribute, can our adjuvants add something, can we within a month had a document for the South African government on what are the options, which platforms. So it mobilizes on our side enormous energy from the scientists to do something and to help. And of course, when the opportunity came, late in the year to participate and in the WHO program, we gave everything, because we knew that there has to be something other than just complaining or crying. We have to be active. That's my sharing for that time.
Well, I mean, following what Petro said, this is why we are focused right now on R&D and developing our drug substance, producing our drug substance. I mean, without that, we'll continue to face the same problems. We want, if there is another pandemic, of course, which is going to be, as the West is cloning the gene, Africa is also cloning the gene, so we can produce our own drug substance simultaneously. If not, of course, it is normal and for every country, every leader to take care of our own citizens. You have not finished taking care of your citizens when you start taking these products to other countries. Of course, the citizens will complain. so it's normal. So we want, and this is why this webinar is important, that we focus on the more important thing of doing our R&D, developing our drug substance, so that if there's another pandemic, we don't have to wait to get products from the West. As the genes are being cloned, we have the capacity to clone our genes, we have the capacity to produce our own drug substance simultaneously with the West, and then we'll be able to take care of our continent. Over.
Yeah. If I can just go back to Professor Terblanche for a moment. I was reading that now you actually, I know the trials have not yet begun. You can perhaps update us on the status of the trials, but I was reading that you actually do have a COVID-19 vaccine, an mRNA vaccine that's developed at your facility, and it is called AfriVac 2121. Can you tell us about that? Why you called it that, and what's the status of it? It's so exciting to realize that this vaccine was developed in Africa, in Cape Town, and will be made available to hubs around the continent. Why did you call it that, and what comes next for that vaccine?
Before I give you the explanation for the name, Geoff, thank you. But let me just make a comment, also circling back to what Simon has been saying. Yes, we have to create the capacity to do the drug product locally in Africa if we want to be secure. That requires facilities, suitable facilities to be able to do that, and that requires investments, and that is what's starting to happen also on the continent, which is great. So a proud moment for science, for technology, for really partnerships, global partnerships coming together, and within a period of 18 months, going from nothing, no technology, no platform, a beautiful knowledge base in Wits University, working on mRNA for therapeutic purposes, convert that, utilize that phenomenal knowledge base, working with the Afrigen team, which are manufacturing orientated, good manufacturing practices, quality control, not only R&D, the two complementary, coming together, building a facility, building the infrastructure. It did not exist, get equipment, import the essential materials necessary to make an mRNA vaccine. And we're in preclinical development, and our results compared to reference products are certainly really comparable, and actually in some areas exceptional. Why we call it AfriVac 2021? Afri for Afrigen, but also for Africa. Vac is a vaccine. 21 June 2021 was a landmark day for the continent, and I believe for low and middle income countries, in terms of access to future relevant technology such as mRNA through a global effort. And that was the day when Dr. Tedros announced the creation of the mRNA Hub program. So it's an important day for us. And that 2121, we have now given permanency in the name of this vaccine candidate.
If I could just ask a question to Dr. Agwale. He made the point in his talk, and I think it's a very important one, that fill and finish is not the solution, sort of packaging. And maybe I could just, for background for people, when the major vaccine manufacturers, Pfizer and Moderna, the mRNA manufacturers, when they realized that the WHO was going ahead with this technology transfer hub idea in Africa, their response really was to say, oh, don't worry about it. We will give you our technology by setting up our own little facilities that we will control, and you can do the fill and finish there. And what maybe Canadians listening don't realize is that would really mean that the technology was controlled by those original manufacturers, by Pfizer and Moderna, and there would not be a technology transfer. The idea would be simply that it would be produced under their supervision and then packaged in Africa. And what's exciting about hearing these two scientists is they're saying, no, that's not good enough. We want to develop our own technology because that gives us more control. And what we saw during the pandemic really was that a monopoly system where you have two manufacturers, Moderna and Pfizer, really controlling the global supply of mRNA vaccines is not good enough. It doesn't work. It doesn't work for the world. It might work for wealthy countries. It doesn't work for Africa or for low-income countries. And so maybe if Dr. Agwale can really just elaborate a bit more on that, about why it's so important to control the technology yourself and not merely to be the packager for Moderna and Pfizer.
Well, I mean, as you know, without the proper technology transfer, fill finish is not tech transfer. Fill finish is, in the strictest sense of definition of vaccine manufacturing, is not manufacturing, it's packaging. So if you look at, I mean, piggyback on the drug companies on the continent, there's really no big drug company in Africa. Why? Because they don't have research and development units. I mean, yesterday, Pfizer increased their R&D funds, increase, the amount of money that they put on R&D, because they know the importance of R&D. If you don't have your product, you have your own IP, and you cannot depend on drug substance from other companies. The proper technology transfer is where you transfer the entire technology to the recipient. The recipient is able to produce that drug substance within their facility. Until that is done, that's not tech transfer. I mean, you don't even need the word technology transfer to get drug substance. If you have your money, you buy drug substance for any company and then you do your fill finish. So it is not really tech transfer. So I think that what we need to focus on now is proper technology transfer, or the African manufacturers focusing on research and development to develop their IP. This is the only way we can solve our problem. Without these things happening, I can tell you that if there is another pandemic in the future, we'll go through the same scenario. Even if you have capacity to produce 100 billion doses of fill finish on the continent of Africa, it will mean nothing if you don't control the drug substance, because you still have to depend on the drug substance to come from another company. So that's why the work that Petro is doing, the work that Innovative Biotech is doing, is critical and needs to be supported.
There may be questions from the audience that Marcia would like to get to, but if I could just ask one more question. The other point that occurred to me when doing that story and when visiting Afrigen in Cape Town was thinking about the incredible talent that exists in Africa among young scientists, talented people coming out of universities and colleges that have the capability to do everything that's being done in the West, but they don't have the opportunity because the facilities didn't exist, the financing didn't exist, the infrastructure didn't exist. And this is, I think, what's exciting about what's happening now, is that there are these opportunities. And Professor Terblanche will know some of the people I talked to. There was a young scientist named Happy at Afrigen who was really before Afrigen started up. She was unemployed. She was very, very talented. Had done postdoctoral work. Was a brilliant young scientist, but didn't have any opportunities. And she was even thinking about possibly leaving South Africa and going, to the West, which is a lot of people do. But because Afrigen now exists, she was hired. She was able to take her talents and give it back to her own community, to South Africa. And I'm wondering if both of you or either of you can talk just about how this projects that you're involved in are going to be able to help mobilize the human talent that exists in your countries.
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
Go ahead, Simon.
Okay. I think, this is one of the, pinpoint that they try to use to diminish what we are doing on the continent of Africa. I have tons and tons of CVs of Africans in diaspora working in these big companies. I want to return back home to contribute to this novel initiative. So that is not an issue. I mean, the producing vaccine, it's only in R&D that you need PhDs. All the other aspects of vaccine manufacturing is just good hands. Few months of training, they're able. So that is even not a barrier. It's not even supposed to be mentioned. But all kinds of barriers, pinpoints will be brought forward to say we are not prepared to do that. All we need, because I mean, this is what we have been focusing on, is to get the African leaders to understand that this is very important, it needs to be done, and then they commit to supporting this initiative, because nobody, no organization, no institution will come and solve a problem for us. You need to sit down with the scientists and ask them questions, how do we get this thing done? And, you know, look at the resources that we need to make this happen on the continent. And then our good friends from the West will come and partner with us, and then we make this happen. But that is not an issue. It's not an issue I have. If we're to have a factory today, to have all the experts from all over the world that are tired, they want to contribute to seeing something done on their continent, come together to make that happen. Over.
Yes, and let me add to that, Geoff, this is such an important issue. So Afrigen made a decision, we will hire locally. And you've seen the team. We've gone from 22 people to 111 today.
Wow.
And these are people in R&D, but also GMP manufacturing. We have brought in young people that was unemployed from the streets, and we're training them as GMP cleaners. We're training them to understand the principles of GMP. If we just look at the basic statistics, by the year 2030, 25% of the world population will live on this continent. The average age will be 19. We have the workforce. We need to have these facilities and the will to train them, to give them experience. And if we do not build a manufacturing sector on this continent, and that includes drugs, APIs, pharmaceuticals, and diagnostics, we will fail our future generations because we will not be able to give them quality positions and quality jobs. It is absolute of utmost importance.
Okay. Marcia, do we have audience questions, or do you want me to keep going? Or
We do have a few audience questions. One that I'm going to get in before I turn to the audience is a lot of what you're talking about also turns on finances. How do you finance this establishment of platforms, getting the facilities? How do you do this?
yeah, and you could mention there that Canada, the Canadian government did contribute, I think it was $15 million. So the Canada is one of the early funders of this project in Cape Town.
Thanks, Geoff.
So Simon is in a slightly different position, and he can share some of the challenges that he has to work through. For Afrigen and the mRNA Hub, it's absolutely amazing. We are funded by the governments of Canada, Belgium, France, Germany, Switzerland, European Commission, Team Europe, Norway, South Africa. Also by the African Union to support Senegal, which is part of the network to build further capacity. So this program beautifully is funded by the taxpayers of the world who wants to make this happen, if you really think about it. Simon, your case is slightly different, and you have specific challenges that you have to face. You want to share some of that?
Yes. I mean, Petro case is different because Afrigen is the mRNA WHO global hub. So getting those resources, coming through Afrigen is not a big deal. But as a local vaccine manufacturer and a member of the African Vaccine Manufacturing Initiative, I can tell you that this is the biggest problem that African manufacturers are facing, because getting the development finance institutions to finance your program is a huge tax and almost impossible. And several other companies that have good ideas have dropped off along the line. So, and that is why we are, just like what is done in India, encouraging the African leaders, good friends of Africa, to look at the various initiatives on the continent and see how they can support. I mean, India, basically, as you know, the pharmacy of the world, left manufacturing in the hands of the private sector. The government supports, intervenes. As you know, during the COVID, the government intervened with $400 million to 2 companies to increase the production of the COVID vaccine. So these are the types of things and the kind of things that we want to see on the continent of Africa, where the government deliberately supports the manufacturers, and this is the only way we can see this happen. So Petro has, Afrigen has a very exciting story, because they are WHO hub, and of course, naturally, everybody will focus on funding that, but that's just one initiative on the continent, but there are 1,001 other initiatives that need other innovative financing, to make this happen.
Thank you. We do have a growing list of people who put in Q&A, so I'm going to read several of them and ask you to choose to who would like to respond. The first one is a gentleman saying, I think it's equally important to develop the quality technical pools to handle the vaccine manufacture from beginning to finished product. They should also be given enough exposure to those technical pools with the sum of the global leading vaccine manufacturers. So that's one question. And another one is from a Canadian lady by the name of Deborah Simpson. And she was wondering whether either panelist had heard of an IDRC, that's a Canadian International Development Research Center institution. It funded a project on gendered impacts of COVID-19 in Africa, which was jointly administered with Oxfam Canada and the African Economic Research Consortium. So she was interested if you had heard anything about this particular project. And then the third one I'm going to throw out there, and then you choose which ones you want to respond to, is a thank you from Abraham Alabi. Thank you to the presenters. For many years, Dr. Agwale has been a leading voice towards building local capacity for vaccine production on the African continent. Can he share with us what has been the bane of his effort? I think I know what that's going to be, succeeding to date. What has changed now that will make this much needed capacity will succeed? And what has become of the initiatives such as the African AIDS Vaccine Program, AAVP, and the African Vaccine Manufacturing Initiative, AVMI? So there are 3 questions out there, and there are more in the queue. So I'll turn over to you and let you deal with those.
Let me take quick ones, and then Simon certainly talk about some of the great initiatives in building capacities. Firstly, let me answer Deborah on IDRC. IDRC, no IDRC quite well. My previous life also supported by it in projects. For this particular program, we have not connected with it. I've actually, in a way, forgot a bit about it, but it's a great initiative from the Canadian government to support critical programs. On quality, to our German question, very important, without a quality system, without stringent regulatory authority and maturity levels 3+ in the regulatory systems and companies adhering to stringent regulatory requirements and quality management systems, we cannot create this industry. We are acutely aware of that. Therefore, if you go to Afrigen today, I have more people in quality control and quality assurance than in production, and that's how it is. We've received tremendous support from PATH and from other European specialists and entities to support us on the quality side. And we've in fact sending some of our people to European European training centers to train in quality, because the continent needs quality training and quality management people. So important, very important, and again, we are being greatly supported by our partners to grow those skills. Simon.
I mean, of course, quality is vaccine. Without quality, you will not have a product. You are making something that is supposed to go to healthy people. It's not like drugs that is taken by people that are sick. So, the process for producing those products have to be according to the most stringent regulatory environment. The other participant mentioned African vaccine, Africa AIDS vaccine program and African vaccine manufacturing initiative. Before we had AVMI, there's a saying that if you want to kill any initiative, you bring it to Africa, it dies naturally. So AVP was one of those initiatives that came on board to develop HIV vaccine for the continent, and then it eventually died naturally. So this is not the true story of Africa. We want to change that. Not all initiatives that come to Africa die. We want to see initiatives survive. We are determined to make that happen. AVMI is the African Vaccine Manufacturing Initiative, which is the umbrella of all vaccine manufacturers on the continent of Africa, will not die. It has come to stay. It will continue to expand, and it will make sure that Africa produces their own vaccines and other biologics, and the goal of 60% of our vaccines by 2040 will be met. We're working hard on that. We want to see that happen, and good individuals and companies, Innovative, Afrigen, Biovac, what's the name of the other South African company, and so we are working together to make sure that this happens. It's not, we're not working as silos. We're working together under the umbrella of the African Vaccine Manufacturing Initiative. So if there's any support that is coming from outside, if it comes through the African Vaccine Manufacturing Initiative, it goes to all the manufacturers. So that's how we have set up the structure to make sure that this is not one of the other initiatives that will come and die naturally.
Very good. Petro, there was a question specifically to you about this question of the proposed mRNA vaccine approach, how you were going to overcome the cold chain requirement, which would be essential for the eventual rollout in many settings in Africa.
Yeah, great question. We realized quite early on in this project that when we're on our own, we develop in a platform, we develop our own vaccines. So we also then have the freedom to change the target product profile. Because speed was so important and because we have to have a reference product that we can validate and demonstrate that our platform is suitable to be transferred to other entities to empower them to develop mRNA vaccines, we chose to go full way modeling the Pfizer and Moderna vaccine. So the vaccine that we've developed at the moment, the cold chain requirements are -20 or more. However, within 2 months after this program started, we already partnered with a company in Belgium who has a proprietary lipid that they prepared to make available to us and licensed to us that allows us to formulate the mRNA in a drug product which can be lyophilized and is stable at between 2 to 8 degrees. So you are absolutely right. We need to ensure that the products we develop in Africa can be taken up by the Africa healthcare systems, because a vaccine means nothing if it doesn't end up in the arms of people. It's vaccination that saves life, not vaccine. So a very important question, and we are working very hard to change that target product profile.
So another interesting question, kind of on a different level, is asking the speakers to comment on the internal, intra-country and intra-continent political obstacles to your projects.
I mean, for a continent like Africa, of course, political instability plays a role to whatever you're doing. It's unlike the West, whoever, you know, is the leader does not affect because the systems are well developed. That's not the case, you know, in Africa. But again, that is not an excuse for us not to move ahead because, you know, if we, and this is the reason why the Indian pharma company developed very fast and it became the pharmacy of the world, because there was a clear division. You know, manufacturing should be handled by the private sector, and then the government supports you. So it is when you make government part of your initiative, then it becomes a problem. Because if there's change in government and, you know, and so on, it affects, you know, the whatever that you are doing. So I think that we are pushing for the India model, where the private sector completely handles the manufacturing of biopharmaceutical products, and the government regulates, and the government provides support and intervenes where necessary, rather than government being part of the initiative. Because if government is part of the initiative, then the initiative suffers if there are issues with the government. So how we propose that African adopt the Brazilian model, I mean the Indian model.
And if I can add, critically important, government to support and incentivize local production. Simon mentioned earlier the struggles for a biotechnology startup company to get sufficient finance to build the Africa we want to. And there's a part of the Afrigen that we have that's not the hub that has exactly the same challenges. So unless our governments create policies where they give preferential local procurement and provide offtake agreements to their own companies, private entities producing vaccines, we're going to have a very difficult time to reach the 60% margin. We have financing can be closed out if there's offtake agreements from governments and commitments to locally procure. We're driving that through the PAVM and the African vaccine manufacturing initiative very, very hard because we believe it's a critical success factor. The second component is to ensure that trade barriers are lowered between the continental parties. And thirdly, and the others, is intellectual property, to ensure that the intellectual property reform of the continent is as such that there is examination, that there is careful public health considerations given before intellectual property are registered without review. So there are a few things, but I think if anyone would ask me what is the most important, preferential local procurement.
Our colleagues from MSF have put in an interesting question here. And the comment is, the emphasis here has been on providing vaccines for Africa, but the facilities are in particular countries. Just as India, the pharmacy of the world, shut off exports to COVAX for months during COVID, how will the interests of the African continent be balanced against the domestic interest of the countries where production is actually occurring?
And again, a great question. MSF, one of the civil society organizations, has really been supporting also our initiatives. If we look carefully on how the African manufacturing partnership strategy is going to be unfold, we know where the big markets are. We know they are east, west, north, and south. We require a leadership of the African Union to be strategic, to work together, to place platforms in areas, to support platforms strategically across the continent, to support vaccine portfolio and candidates and manufacturing across the continent to ensure that the continent, firstly, routine vaccines, we can reach the targets, and to keep facilities in pandemic preparedness. And those are commitments that governments will have to make, and in public-private partnerships work together to create facilities that can be very quickly mobilized for pandemic preparedness. I hope that with a future pandemic, and that Africa felt the pain of not being able to access vaccines for many, many reasons, that there will be a united not front, but a united value system to look after the continent, and not single countries within the continent only.
Simon, do you want to respond?
Yes, I think there are I mean, a lot of initiatives that are ongoing on the continent to make sure that we address this issue. I know that the health regional blocks, you know, like the ECOWAS, which is the West African Health Organization, have harmonized the regulation of products in the region, so that when the product is registered in one country, you don't need, you know, to register that same product in other 15 West African regions. But you can go ahead and market those products in these countries. In addition to that, they have created the pool procurement, the resources in one place, and then they are able to give advanced purchase commitment to the manufacturers, so that it will incentivize those manufacturers to produce the products and supply over X number of years. So that guarantees the market for the manufacturers, you know, so that is being worked out. And then the PAVM, as you know, the Partnership for African Vaccine Manufacturing, is also working on that on the continental level, where we have the AMA, which is the African Medicines Agency, that will play the role of, you know, the WHO PQ, so that whatever product that is approved by AMA will now be used throughout the continent of Africa. So all these initiatives are being worked out, and there are lots of initiatives to strengthen AMA to play the role. There's no point. I mean, products made in India are sold in India, products made in China. Why will African manufacturers be subjected to WHO PQ before their products are procured by the international agencies? There's no African manufacturer that will survive that, because the process of getting that done we weigh you down and you'll be out of business before you have a product that can be bought. So all these initiatives, I mean, these gaps or pinpoints have been addressed so that we create a platform for African manufacturers to survive. PEPFAR, for example, the US program only buys products that are WHO PQ. For example, how many companies in Africa are in that position? So at the end of the day, you have these resources coming to Africa, but there's no African manufacturer that is able to supply products with that initiative. And the money is diverted to other countries, and then all we get is products. So there's no way the local manufacturer will survive. So all these things, being worked on to make sure that, some of these policies change, so that if a product is registered, let's say in South Africa by SAPRA, the US PEPFAR should be able to buy that product for Africa, not necessarily depend on WHO pre-qualification before they buy that product. Over.
Thank you. One other big question posed by Bruce Moore. During a recent global meeting of effective development cooperation, there was only nominal discussion about localizing development, something he would consider a precondition to foster local, national, regional manufacturing. Then the question, what can Canadians do to promote our government taking supportive action? Something he asked because Canada had earlier resisted the proposed TRIPS waiver, seemingly in response to the pushback from Pfizer and Moderna. Where are the resistance points that Canadians should work on to remove this within our own government?
Bruce, this is a big question. So maybe let me make a comment about local development. The earlier statement. It's interesting that in the early discussions of the PAVM, the drive was certainly around health security, a new health order, local manufacturing. But the debate has moved on with the realization that vaccine manufacturing is in fact a development imperative, because of the nature of it in terms of the benefits it brings back to a country, socio-economic benefits, skills, job creation, direct foreign investment, health security, GDP contribution. If all of that is combined, this is actually a development imperative for the continent and for supplying vaccines. On the TRIPS waivers and Canada's position, the TRIPS waiver for vaccines was, as you know, was approved, and it was a watered down version, but it did brought parties together, and it did put some peg in the sand for future discussions. What do we ask the Canadian government? We're not asking governments to not recognize intellectual property. We're not asking the protection of intellectual property. We ask for, in case of public need and public health, and to consider means and, of course, channels and instruments that's been created 20 years ago to be able to have access in case of need for governments to support that and to honor that. I am, these are, you can see my hesitation. These are so complex. This is a 2-day seminar on its own, just to look at what are the consequences of decisions, the unintended consequences. But there are discussions about what is the public good. Are vaccines a public good? And these discussions will continue to happen, and it will impact on how we look at intellectual property, how we look at the impacts of intellectual property in times of a pandemic. And there were some case studies from McGill University on what was the intellectual property considerations during COVID-19 for the vaccines. And these are very interesting discussions and case studies that has been brought up. But I think maybe that's a webinar or for a topic for a next webinar, and it will be, again, it's a very interesting and a very complex one. Bruce, I'm not sure that I've answered your question. I've tried.
Simon, do you want to add anything to this, or this? No. Okay.
She has said everything, so I think we can move on to the next question.
Okay. So we're running to the end of the time of the webinar, so I'm just going to turn briefly to Geoff, who's been sitting there very patiently, thinking he might have another question or two to pose. If not, we can turn back to Sheikh. What do you have anything further?
Well, really, I just wanted to thank the two scientists for their incredible patience and generosity in explaining all this today. If I don't know if there's time for one more question, but what always occurs to me in the background to these discussions is other neglected diseases. I mean, we've been talking about COVID, but the reason that Africa needs vaccines is other diseases that have really been neglected by the Western establishment, the Western pharmaceutical sector. I mean, I think a lot about malaria, which has been killing millions of people for decades and decades, centuries, and it's only this year are we beginning to see the first vaccines finally rolling out for malaria. And, I don't know if Professor Terblanche wants to briefly just talk about this, but the potential of mRNA vaccines for the diseases that affect Africa more than other regions and that have been neglected for so long. I mean, this is where it's so exciting to see this development happening, this technology transfer hub, because there are so many, diseases that have just been clearly neglected for decades and decades.
Thank you. And I'm going to also ask Simon to come in here, because first comment that I want to make, mRNA is not going to solve all Africa's vaccine requirements. It is the technology is just not suitable for certain disease vectors. However, the technology has demonstrated that it has the ability to rapidly develop, scale, screen, and to develop safe and effective vaccines. I think there's a great place for other technologies, and the VLP platforms are increasingly important. If we just look at the 22 diseases for Africa, there is the legacy ones. You've mentioned TB. Cholera, we have now fantastic news of IVI transferring technology to BioVac for a cholera vaccine. That is what the continent needs. Yellow fever, we are producing only yellow fever vaccines, but we need improvements, and we need a bigger volumes. HPV, the number one cancer in women, cervical cancer. It's a virus-induced cancer. It is one of the top 5 causes of death, cancer causes of death on the continent. HPV, preventative therapeutic vaccines. mRNA would be able to contribute there. Malaria, there's an mRNA malaria vaccine in pipeline development, and there's also other platforms. HIV, going to be a difficult one. mRNA will certainly do whatever we can to try and contribute to that. Ebola, influenza, RSV, Lassa fever, Rift Valley fever, chikungunya, all suitable for mRNA platforms, but we have to make sure that's cost effective and that it brings the safety and efficacy that it needs. But certainly mRNA, very relevant for the needs of Africa for many reasons. It's rapid, its speed, and also its modalities in terms of economies of scale. Simon, you want to say something about VLPs and the contribution that platform is going to make to our needs?
Well, I mean, Petro said the mRNA is not going to solve all our problems. It's a new technology. So far, there's only one disease that mRNA is able to address. And then we still don't understand everything about that yet because of the frequency of vaccinations and so on. So there's still a lot to learn. But if you're looking at other platforms, and that is why it is risky for African to just focus on one, platform. We have to open up to other platforms. If you look at, let's say, the platform that we are interested in, which is the virus-like particle, this platform was used to develop two very important vaccines, these vaccines have stood the test of time for decades. We're talking about hepatitis B vaccine, and then the HPV, that is a human papillomavirus vaccine. And as you know, the recent studies done in India and Papua New Guinea, it showed that one dose, because the HPV started with 3 doses and eventually 2 doses. And now the trials done in India and Papua New Guinea is showing that 1 dose of the vaccine protects potentially for life. So, I mean, using platforms like this to develop other vaccines, like HIV, Ebola. And so the question is, are we going to get the same durability even for COVID? I mean, COVID now, we're looking at annual vaccines, based on the mRNA and other platform. But how about the VLP-based COVID vaccines? Are we going to get the same result? So these are questions that we'll be able to answer over the years. So it is risky to focus on only one platform. That's why we work closely with Petro. We're open to new ideas. We're not close to focusing and pushing a particular platform, but what is the best platform for the continent of Africa? That is what we are focused on doing. Over.
Well, what a wonderful panel you've been. This is so exciting. And there's 2 great ideas for future webinars. One maybe on the licensing and TRIPS issue. Another very important one on the whole distribution issue, which is the next step beyond manufacturing, and of course, vital to all of the continent. So I'm going to thank you all very much. I'm going to turn over to our chair, to Sheikh, to give the final comments.
Merci éperdument, Marcia, pour cette excellente animation. Comme toujours, on a beaucoup de nouveautés et beaucoup d'informations pour notre audience. On behalf of the Africa Study Group of the Canadian International Council here in Ottawa, I would like to thank our panelists for their excellent presentation. Professor Petro, Dr. Simon, and Geoff. Geoff, it has been a real pleasure to see you again. I know that you have a lot of fans in the Africa Study Group. Your presence, the presence of the 3 of you in this panel is highly appreciated. Thank you so much. The Africa Study Group will follow this process of producing vaccine in Africa and for Africans. Thank you for stressing the importance of the support of the African government and the AU for this important African project. The African Study Group will very much appreciate being able to reconstitute this panel in the near future. I would like to thank our colleagues, Mafouya Doussouman, Communication Director of the Africa Study Group, as well as Gillian Leblanc from the Canadian International Council National Capital Branch, for all the technical support that went into organizing this session. Please note that this session has been recorded and will be posted on our YouTube page. The Africa Study Group is directly affiliated with the Canadian International Council, and we encourage our members to join the Canadian International Council, National Capital Branch. That will be an excellent move. This invitation is extended to our members and our audience, both in Canada and outside of Canada. The next Africa Study Group webinar will be next week, February 6th, on the theme towards strengthening Canada-Africa relations. That webinar has been designed as a roundtable to provide an additional platform for academic experts and some leaders of African diaspora to share their insights on the challenges and perspectives ahead in developing a new Canadian engagement strategy with Africa. It will be all for today. Bonjour à Johannesburg, bonjour à Cape Town, bonjour aux États-Unis, bonjour à notre audience ici au Canada, bonjour à notre audience en Afrique. Je sais qu'au Sénégal, nous sommes suivis aujourd'hui à l'université Cheikh Anta Diop. I wish you good health, and depending on where you are, a good day, good afternoon, and good night. Merci et à la prochaine.